Today we are going to talk debt. Hi, I'm John McNeil, and this is the Invest Strong Network. Welcome. Not just any debt, but our U.S. national debt. I want to describe it, define it, and also add relevance to your life and mine. All right. So, as a nation, the federal government has operations just everywhere. Defense, interest payments, just everywhere, right? And of course, it takes an enormous amount of money to do this. Now, the government receives most of its revenue through taxation, right? But there are years when the government spends more than it takes in through taxation, and thus you'll have a budget deficit. And the amount of that deficit is then added on to an overall national debt. And that's what we'll be talking about today. Now, the medical crisis that is gripping the country and the globe has just done crazy things to our national debt. And it make the numbers that I'll be talking about here, they'll be moving around all over the place. They are astronomically large numbers. So I beg your patience and please, let's pay very close attention. All right. So, and for fiscal year 2019, the federal government had a total national debt of around $21 trillion, a staggering amount of money, obviously. Now, that, though, should be compared to the size of the overall American economy, because the economy would then go a long way towards paying the debt in future years. So whereas the federal government had 21 trillion in debt, we had a $22 trillion economy to kind of feed off of. And so that was actually, the debt was quite manageable for the size of our economy. Now, in 2020, that has all changed. And it has not changed for the better, right? So the government has put out stimulus. They've done all kinds of things in order to keep the economy buoyant through the medical crisis, global pandemic that we're going through. Now, their assistance has been augmented by the Federal Reserve. Right. So the Federal Reserve has been creating digits, printing money, just pumping it into the economy to keep everything going until such time that hopefully we'll be able to come out of this and be able to get back on a more solid footing. But let's describe the debt. All right. So as I mentioned, as of fiscal year 2019, the debt was roughly $21 trillion. Now, that is kind of tricky because the way the government is structured, about 25%, a full quarter of that debt, and we'll put debt in air quotes, is money that is owed by the federal government to other federal government agencies, right? So we'll break it down like this. We'll call the Treasury account. We'll call that the husbandly account, right? And we'll call the other government agencies, Social Security, also even Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are fully owned and operated by the government, and they're spinning off profits that are turned over to the government. We'll call those the wifely accounts, right? So what the government has done, the federal government, the Treasury, has done really for over 50 years now, is the Social Security Administration in particular, through the taxation, payroll tax, and other things, they've ran enormous surpluses. And those surpluses they turned over to the husbandly account to purchase bonds, which basically gave the Treasury the money to continue to operate in current accounts. So, as a technical matter, the Treasury should pay back those funds back to the wifely account at some time, right? But technically, you ask yourself, well, if a wife loans money to the husband and then the husband spends it, is that really a household debt? Well, yes and no. For accounting purposes, the answer is yes, it is a debt. And it's added on to the overall federal debt. But in reality, when one hand loans money to the other hand, it's of less consequence than if you are borrowing money from, let's say, a neighbor, right? Or from a bank, you see. So some economists, when they look at this, they kind of push out the 25%, kind of exclude that, and then look at the debt that is held by the public, and then debts that are held by international organizations and countries as the real debt, right? And of course, they have loaned these funds to the government by basically buying government bonds, which the U.S. Treasury offers, quarterly, and people buy these bonds, and thus by buying the bonds, they're loaning money to the government. Now, the Federal Reserve, like I mentioned, they have been creating digits and printing money like crazy in order to support corporations and investment houses, ETF makers, things like that, in order to keep the financial system liquid. And they're spending trillions of dollars to do this. So, question, what the Federal Reserve is doing, the money that they are spending, is that adding to the national debt? Strictly speaking, the answer to that is no, because what the Federal Reserve is doing they're not using funds out of the Treasury, you see. And so if it's not coming from the Treasury itself, then it's not adding to the debt. However, by creating these digits and by printing this money, the Federal Reserve will certainly at some time be stoking inflation in the future. That higher inflation will cause interest rates to increase. The federal government, one of its largest expenditures is the expense of financing its debt. And so if interest rates increase, that will blow up the debt like you would not believe. And that day is coming. Right? It's coming. Now, it's not here, and it may not even be next year, but eventually that day will come. So what the Federal Reserve is doing now will add to the overall national debt at some point in the future through higher inflation and higher interest rates. But as a technical accounting matter, it does not add to the debt at this moment. Okay, now the federal government, like I said, through the Treasury, is spending money like crazy to keep the economy afloat. And the reality is, those numbers compared to the size of the economy is now becoming way askewed. So you'll have a situation where in fiscal year FY 2020, the federal government will have $25 trillion of debt on the books. And the economy will actually shrink down to $20 trillion. That is absolutely disastrous no matter how you look at it. You have the debt that is skyrocketing. You have the economy that is shrinking. That is not the combination that you ever want to see. Now, since the end of the Second World War, in fact, our debt has moved up markedly, but it was offset because the economy was also growing markedly at the same time. But this combination of a skyrocketing debt and a shrinking economy is disastrous. Now, we may come out of 2020 in one piece, but in what they call the out years, right? The out years, these are years that they have not been able to fully account for as of right now. So we're talking about fiscal year 2023, 2024, 2025, and then, onwards. We are looking at one hell of a train wreck in our national financing. And this will affect every market that you invest in. It certainly will affect the debt markets as interest rates will increase. Certainly, it will affect the real estate markets for the same reason. Interest rates will increase. That means that rents will have to increase. That means mortgage rates will increase. All of these things, which are extremely detrimental to economic growth, will inevitably have to happen. Now, what about the equity markets? Well, obviously, the equity markets will take some of that. They'll take some of that pain. Now, they're less affected directly by increasing interest rates, but eventually it will affect the equity markets also. But the point is, overall economic growth will slow dramatically going forward. At the same time, the debt will continue to increase incredibly to keep everything going. And of course, the federal government may have to, and almost certainly will have to, increase taxes in order to pay down a lot of this debt so that interest rates won't go through the roof, right? And that is also detrimental to the overall economy, right? So, don't mean to be a downer, but just wanted to educate InvestStrong viewers on this whole business of the national debt and national financing and whatnot. It can get very opaque, very complex. So I've tried to distill it down to a more digestible fashion, right? All right. Hope you found it interesting and informative. If you have, please smash that like button. I appreciate it. Really, really do. And leave a comment. Right? If I messed up somewhere, let me know, right? I'm not perfect. I'd like to know. And of course, subscribe. Always subscribe. All right. Thank you very much and good luck.